The Groundpounders were a regiment of Astra Militarum composed of the most veteran forces of Crusade Group 742. Operating as a combined arms unit of mixed regimental assets, though composed largely of heavy infantry and armored companies, transfer to this regiment was seen as a sign of exceptional skill amongst the fighting men and women of the Crusade. Thanks to the extensive training and high status, the Groundpounders represented the very peak of the Imperial Guard within the sector-wide battle force. Although their history is littered with impressive victories, narrow escapes and bitter defeats, the most intriguing tale of this regiment are the circumstances of its retirement. At the end of a 50-year service record, the Groundpounders were deployed as the vanguard in the liberation of Corvus Quintus. A planet of scattered human settlements, it was nominally under the control of various roaming clans of orcs who used the world as a staging ground for piracy throughout the subsector. The opportunity to end this threat was tempting to the Crusaders' leaders, carrying the favor of both local trading powers and Segmentum Command. Deployed ahead of the main fleet, the Groundpounders were tasked with shattering a hub of mech shops built upon the ruins of an ancient spaceport. They would break the Orcs' largest stronghold on the world and cripple their ability to strike off-planet in a single blow. It was a grueling operation, but ultimately the Groundpounders found success and opened the way for the liberation to begin in earnest. This great victory was marred by the loss of the regiment's sole super heavy tank, the Baneblade designated the Last Call. The vehicle overextended as it chased a group of mech boys from the ruins to the spaceport, ambushed in the thin strip of wasteland where the orc-twisted manufactorums gave way to thick forests and was wrecked with all hands lost. One disaster followed another as, in a garbled mix of astropathic messages and vox transmissions, the Guardsmen came to a grim realization. The primary bulk of Crusade Group 742, its home fleet, including the largest battleship and troop carriers, had disappeared in a freak warp storm. This included both the Groundpounders' means of extraction and the frontier population earmarked to settle the spaceport. With the only void-worthy vessels reduced to smoking ruins by their own hands, the regiment was stranded. But the Groundpounders were the most famous fighting force of their crusade for good reason, and even in the face of this calamity, they did not sit idle. The soldiers moved to claim the spaceport as their own, christening it the township of Waypoint. The wrecks of orc ships and construction silos were leveled with demolisher shells, clearing the ancient spaceport to make way to the prefabricated structures of barracks and armories. With the help of its few remaining tech priests, facilities for producing ammunition and promethium were restored, whilst its logistical teams and surveyors sought out the key assets for food production. The most mobile units of the Groundpounders ventured out through the forest and over the mountaintops, returning with the news of the scattered human settlements that dotted the planet's northern continent. Slowly these trips became more frequent. Roads were carved from rock and great swathes of trees were felled, and Waypoint found itself at the epicenter of a long network of trade and travel. Through long years, the township grew, surely and steadily. As its former soldiers settled with their families in homes of their own, and its oldest members started to pass away peacefully, a fate they had never dared to dream of in their regiment's glory days, they realized that Waypoint had become something truly rare. The collection of low bunkers and makeshift shelters gave way to fully restored buildings and homes. The wide concourse of its spaceport became a gathering place for trade and diplomacy. Soon Waypoint was formally recognized as the capital of the disparate human communities of Corvus Quintus. Amidst it all, the remains of the Last Call stood. It was first used as a boundary mark to denote the limits of the settlement before one particularly inventive tech priest was able to restore its generator and provide the surrounding buildings with power. As the town's industry grew, other means of energy were secured. It was then that the old wreck became a meeting place and a forum, a symbolic point for the former soldiers to discuss matters of import and plan their future, reminded by the hulking wreck just how costly a mistake could be. But with time, these meetings shifted to the gathering hub of activity that was the spaceport's concourse, and the Last Call was once again left idle. It was then that familiar faces returned to the ancient machine. The surviving family of its original driver claimed the wreck as their inheritance and, showing the same understanding of machines that their forebearer had possessed, gave it a new purpose. The area around it had long since been cleared, giving ample space to construct a series of dining tables and cooking areas covered by a heavy tarpaulin. The generator was more than capable of providing the necessary energy for equipment, heat and lighting, free from the issues of power cuts that the rest of the township still suffered. With some moderate to severe tech heresy, the primary fuel tanks and secondary plasma drives were converted into a fermentation processor, providing the town with the brewery it had been sorely lacking since rations of alcohol had grown critically low. In a moment of inspiration, and through many months of labor, the last call was transformed into Waypoint's first and most successful public house. As the town grew into its new status, the focus of the population began to shift, and like in so many battles, the venerable Baneblade became the anchor of great efforts. It drew in first dozens and then hundreds of patrons, from families bearing the newest generations in their arms to the burly, scarred remnants of the original Groundpounders, and the many people from across Corvus Quintus who now called Waypoint their home. It was in these years that the orcs returned, descending from the highlands and thick forests to raid Waypoint and its long roads through the wilderness. Though they were retired, the men and women of this town were still guardsmen, and their families bore the same steely determination. The fighting was fierce, conducted in great campaigns that saw the few remaining Valkyries of the regiment reduce leagues of forest to ash, whilst those armored vehicles that still operated crushed greenskins under their treads. Without their mechs to enhance them, the orcs had to become feral, striking with little more than spears and stone swords, yet each of them was larger and more ferocious than any human. The cost was high, reducing the streets and buildings of the town into kill boxes and bloody melees. In these days, the last call served as a bastion, a choke point against the feral orcs, with its lone functioning side sponson, the pintle stubbers that had been repositioned to cover a wider area around the wreck, and the great turret, which, though no longer mechanically functioning, could be winched into position and fired manually. Along its hull and surrounding walls, its staff and patrons would defend their town with lasgun and bayonet, forcing the orcs back into their dark corners. After many years, a miracle struck the people of Corvus Quintus as the skies were lit with the multicolored flashes of warp translations. Crusade Group 742 had returned to the world, and with them came a joyous surprise. The Groundpounders had assumed the fleet had been destroyed in the warp, leaving them to fend themselves on this backwater planet. The Crusade Group, tossed onto the other side of the galaxy and having slowly worked its way back, had expected to find little more than bones of an undersupplied and abandoned regiment, gnawed on by the orcs they had come to defeat. However, the return of the fleet also came with a shock. Due to the varied eddies of the warp and the relativistic nature of time, Crusade Group 742 had experienced only 16 years of separation from the Groundpounders. Meanwhile, for the people of Corvus Quintus, nearly 70 years had passed since first landing. To those members of the fleet that had known the original Groundpounders, the shock of meeting their grandchildren was profound. To those who had left families on the fleet, a blissful reunion was less common than the realization of lives irrevocably changed, or meetings missed by just a scant few weeks. But the luxury of time to address these revelations was not forthcoming, and as the orcs once again rose in great numbers and threatened to swarm across the world, a hasty counteroffensive was organized. Spearheaded by the War Dogs, a formerly junior regiment that had risen to fill the gap left by the Groundpounders, the orcs were met in the field and gradually pushed from the face of the continent. Forced further into the mountains than ever before, the massed artillery of the War Dogs sent rockfalls to bury the orcs in their thousands. As the last identified gathering of greenskins were cut apart, the Crusade's original aim was finally met, 70 years in the making. Upon this victory, however, a wider issue was raised. According to the Munitorum roster, the Groundpounders were still an active Imperial Guard unit, and it was the right of the Crusade Group to mobilize them at will. The new generation were not eager to ship off into the stars now that their world had just been secured. Likewise, the few original Groundpounders were not willing to see their homes and families crippled by an imperial tithe that, as a newly settled world, would not be properly due for another 5 generations. However, the Crusade group had labored hard to reach the world again, and in its effort had lost much of its strength. As word came through of Abaddon's 13th Black Crusade reaching the Cadian Gate, every force this side of the Segmentum Obscurus had been called upon to report its ability. Under scrutiny from the Munitorum, Sector Command, and even the Inquisition, responding under strength would doubtless see the Crusade group divided across the battle zones of Cadia, picking apart in a stroke the careful system of mutual alliances and political influences that had kept the unit alive and thriving for millennia. The two sides met and arguments flared, as the leaders of the Waypoint and its united settlements clashed with the representatives of the Crusade. Inevitably, weapons were drawn, and the parley threatened to explode into a storm of self-destructive violence before a stroke of inspiration allowed cooler heads to prevail. A representative of the War Dog's 3rd Armored Company came forth with a solution. Billeted a few blocks away from the last call, the captain had admired the state of the vehicle that had served as her company's local watering hole. Noting that the engine still seemed to operate well enough to give power and drive the fermentation tanks, she had arranged with the barkeep to allow her company's engine seer to take a closer look. The infuriated tech priest had declared the vehicle desecrated beyond belief, but admittedly could be salvaged. In the final communication sent by the Groundpounders before the Crusade group's disappearance, the last call had been written off as lost in action, removing it from the Crusaders' roster. As far as the Munitorum was concerned, the measured effectiveness of a regiment of veteran guardsmen was roughly equivalent to that of a Baneblade. Though it would be nearly a year before the ancient vehicle was declared field-worthy again, the machine spirit of the Baneblade was gradually stoked back into life. The last call now serves in the super heavy detachment of the War Dog's armored companies, commanded by the granddaughter of the vehicle's original driver, who had refused to abandon her livelihood simply because it was being driven across battlefields. Since returning to duty, the vehicle has earned a swathe of accolades and commendations worthy of the legend of the Groundpounders. In recent years, rumors have arisen that the last call maintains some of its fermentation capability. This speculation has been officially debunked and declared heretical by local Mechanicus representatives. Though there is a sharp increase in morale observed in those units assigned to the Baneblade, this has been explained in commissariat reports as the appropriate response of any guardsman at the chance to accompany such a mighty vessel of the Emperor's wrath into combat. The rate of contraband alcohol found amongst the War Dog's armored companies, however, remains unexplained.